It was a bright Saturday afternoon as Marcus Williams pulled into the parking lot of a bustling grocery store. After scanning for a few moments, he found an open spot close to the entrance, a rare piece of luck on a busy day like this. He smoothly eased his car into the spot, double-checked his parking, and began to step out of the vehicle. Before Marcus could fully close his car door, the screech of tires behind him caught his attention. An imposing white SUV sped into the adjacent space, coming to a sharp stop just inches away. The driver's side window rolled down with an aggressive whirr, and Marcus's eyes met the cold, furious stare of a middle-aged white woman. "Hey!" she shouted, jabbing a finger in his direction, her face contorted in anger. "That was my spot." Confused by the sudden outburst, Marcus blinked. He hadn't noticed anyone waiting when he parked. Trying to maintain a calm demeanor, he replied, "Excuse me? I didn't see you." "You didn't see me," the woman cut him off, her voice rising with each word. "Of course you didn't. You people never do." Marcus's heart rate spiked. He knew exactly where this was going. The phrase "you people" hit him like a punch to the gut, loaded with racial undertones. He had experienced this kind of escalation before. What began as a simple parking dispute was now turning into something much more personal, much more toxic. "Look," Marcus said, trying to stay calm. "I didn't see anyone waiting. The spot was open, and I parked." But his reasoned tone only seemed to fuel her anger. "Of course you didn't see me," she snapped, stepping out of her SUV with force, slamming the door shut. "You think you can just take whatever you want, don't you? Think you can just come into decent neighborhoods and ruin everything for people who belong here?" The venom in her words hung in the air. Marcus clenched his jaw. He could feel the eyes of a few nearby shoppers turning toward them, drawn to the rising tension, but none of them intervened. Linda's rage flared up even more intensely. Her voice grew shrill and her words more venomous as she stepped dangerously close to Marcus. "You people think you can just walk in and take whatever you want," she spat, her finger now inches from his chest. "Entitled, lazy, disrespectful. You don't belong here." Marcus tried to take a step back to defuse the situation, but she followed, closing the gap between them with every retreat he made. It's just a parking spot," Marcus said, his voice low, trying to keep himself under control. "I don't want any trouble." "Trouble," she sneered, her face contorting with fury. "You are the trouble. You and your kind coming in here thinking you own everything. You don't even live here, do you? This isn't your community, your neighborhood. You're just here to take, to steal, and to destroy." Marcus's hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he struggled to contain the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He knew where this was heading. He'd seen it play out too many times before. It wasn't about the parking spot anymore. It was about power, about superiority, about making sure he knew that in her eyes he didn't belong. Suddenly, Linda shoved Marcus hard, pushing him backward. The crowd's murmur grew louder, but no one stepped in. Marcus stumbled but caught himself before falling. He turned back to her, his patience wearing thin, his heart pounding. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. The crowd that had gathered was now openly watching, their phones out, recording the scene. But instead of backing down, Linda stepped forward again, her face flushed with rage. "You want to know what's wrong?" she snarled. "You are what's wrong. You don't belong here, and I'm going to make sure you know it." She raised her hand as if to strike him again. Marcus, breathing heavily, stood his ground, his mind racing as he weighed his next move. The situation had spiraled into something much darker and more dangerous, and he knew that no matter how he responded, the judgment of the onlookers would likely fall on him. Marcus felt his chest tighten as the insults kept coming, each word laced with venom. He had heard it before, the racial slurs, the demeaning tone, but today they cut deeper. Standing in front of Linda, who was fuming with unchecked rage, he kept his voice steady. I don't want any trouble," he said, his hands raised in a placating gesture, but his words only seemed to fan the flames. "Trouble? You people are always trouble," Linda spat, her voice rising. The phrase "you people" clung to the air, heavy with the weight of centuries of racial tension. A few passers-by stopped, eyes drawn to the confrontation. Most of them were white, and Marcus could feel their gazes shift toward him, already casting judgment. Linda took a step closer, invading his space, her face twisted in a sneer of disdain. "You think you can just take whatever you want? This isn't your place. You don't belong here." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he refused to give in to the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He tried again to step back, to disengage, but Linda's fury was unrelenting. Without warning, her hand flew through the air, striking him across the face with a loud, stinging slap. The crack of it echoed, and time seemed to slow. Marcus's head snapped to the side, his cheek burning from the force of the blow. His heart pounded in his chest, the humiliation of the public spectacle pressing down on him like a weight. For a brief moment, Marcus froze. The crowd that had gathered held their breath. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for his reaction. His instinct was to walk away, but something inside him, something tired of the constant degradation, pushed back. Before he could stop himself, his hand rose and connected with Linda's face. It wasn't a strike of anger, but a firm, controlled response, a refusal to be treated as less than human. Linda staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek in disbelief. "You hit me," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the air like glass. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, and Marcus could see the shift in their eyes: suspicion, disapproval, fear. Not of her, but of him. He was no longer the man defending himself. In their eyes, he was now the aggressor. Marcus walked into the grocery store, his mind still racing from the encounter. He tried to shake it off as he grabbed a shopping cart, but the sting of Linda's slap, and the weight of the crowd's judgment, clung to him like a shadow. Inside the store was a world away from the hostility outside, filled with the everyday sounds of beeping registers and idle chatter. But Marcus couldn't focus. He knew Linda wasn't done. After quickly grabbing what he needed, he pushed the cart toward the exit, his eyes scanning the parking lot nervously. And then his heart sank. There she was, standing by his car, a look of smug satisfaction on her face as she dragged her keys across the paint, leaving deep, jagged scratches. Marcus froze, watching in horror as she mutilated his car with a twisted sense of righteousness. As he approached, he heard her voice ring out, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "This is what happens when they move into our neighborhoods. They bring nothing but trouble." Her words, filled with malice, struck a chord with those nearby. Marcus could see it, the subtle nods of agreement, the way they avoided his eyes, complicit in their silence. Suddenly, Linda climbed into her SUV, and before Marcus could react, she threw it into reverse, ramming her car into his with a deafening crunch of metal on metal. She looked at him through her open window, laughing as if she had won something. "Go ahead, call the cops," she sneered. "See who they believe." Her attack wasn't just on his car, it was an attack on his very existence, a reminder that in her eyes he would always be less, always be the outsider. The damage was done, but the deeper scars were the ones left by her words, echoing long after the sound of screeching tires had faded. Marcus stood next to his car, his eyes tracing the deep, jagged scratches Linda had carved into the paintwork. His mind raced. The damage was undeniable, but more than that, it was the humiliation that burned inside him. He knew he had to call the police, but dread crept into his thoughts. He had seen how these situations could unfold, how easily the narrative could turn against him. A black man standing in front of a damaged car, facing a white woman who had already proven her aggression. With a deep breath, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed 911. As he spoke to the operator, his voice remained steady, but a knot of anxiety tightened in his chest. What would the officers think? Would they assume he was the aggressor? His thoughts swirled as he ended the call and waited. It wasn't long before 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot. The officers stepped out, their eyes sweeping the scene. Linda, sensing their arrival, immediately transformed. She straightened her posture, her face morphing into an exaggerated display of innocence. She hurried toward them, already in tears, her voice shaking with practiced panic. "He attacked me," Linda wailed, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus. "I was just trying to park, and he went crazy. Look at him. I'm scared for my life." Marcus clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of her words sink into the air. One of the officers, Officer Scott Reynolds, glanced at Marcus, then at Linda, and seemed to lean into her narrative. He walked over to Linda first, his posture open, as if to console her. The other officer, more neutral, stood between them, scanning the scene but saying little. "I didn't touch her," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the rising frustration. "She's lying. Look at the damage to my car. She keyed it while I was inside." But Officer Reynolds seemed to be more concerned with Linda's dramatic retelling. "Let's hear her out," he said, his tone sympathetic, almost paternal. The racial tension thickened, palpable in the silence of the crowd that had gathered to watch. Marcus felt his heart racing, knowing how easily the situation could spiral out of control if he made one wrong move. He had to stay calm, had to stay composed. But every word Linda uttered, every tear that fell from her eyes felt like a tightening noose. Despite Linda's best efforts to portray herself as the victim, Officer Reynolds finally walked over to inspect Marcus's car. The scratches were deep, deliberate. They told a story that even Linda's fabricated tears couldn't erase. Still, Marcus's breath caught in his throat as the officers deliberated. John Matthews, the neutral witness who had observed the entire altercation, stepped forward. "I saw everything," he said, his voice steady. "She's lying. She started yelling at him first, and then she keyed his car. I don't know what she's talking about with the attack, but I didn't see him lay a hand on her until she hit him first." Officer Reynolds exchanged a glance with the other officer, his confidence in Linda's story wavering. The truth was laid bare, and finally the decision came. Reynolds said, his voice firm now, "I'm going to need you to turn around. You're under arrest for property damage and assault." The moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Linda's tears transformed into rage. "What? You can't arrest me. He's the criminal. Look at him," her face twisted into an ugly snarl as she turned to Marcus, her voice dripping with venom. "You filthy animal. This is my neighborhood, you don't belong here." Her words were like poison in the air, and Marcus felt the sting of each one. The crowd stirred, some gasping at her blatant racism, but there were still those whose eyes lingered on Marcus with suspicion, as though Linda's words, hateful as they were, still held weight. The officers led her away, her racist tirade echoing behind them, but the tension in the parking lot remained thick, unresolved. Marcus stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, not from anger but from the bitter reality that no matter what justice was served that day, the deeper injustice of people like Linda would continue to lurk, unchecked, in the shadows. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Linda's lawyer rose to give his opening statement. His voice was calm, almost sympathetic, as he portrayed Linda as a struggling mother pushed beyond her limits. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client, Linda Parker, is not the monster she's been made out to be. She's a hard-working mother, a member of this community, who on that day simply lost control under immense stress." He avoided any mention of the racial slurs she'd hurled at Marcus Williams, sidestepping the deeper issue of her prejudice. He tried to reframe the conflict as a moment of human frailty, not rooted in racism but in stress. Diana Harris, the prosecutor, wasn't having it. When it was her turn, she addressed the jury with precision. "This case isn't about a woman having a bad day. It's about racial bias, about how Linda Parker believed she could assault Marcus Williams simply because of his race. From the very beginning, her words, her actions were fueled by hatred and entitlement." Her voice rang with conviction, cutting through the superficial narrative Linda's lawyer had crafted. Diana painted a vivid picture of systemic racial prejudice, showing how people like Marcus often struggle to defend themselves against baseless accusations that have roots in the color of their skin, not their actions. John Matthews, a neutral witness, took the stand, his gaze steady as he recalled the incident. "I saw everything," he began. Linda was furious the moment Marcus parked. She marched up to him and started yelling that he didn't belong there. His words hung in the air, revealing the unspoken racial undertone of her behavior. Linda's lawyer tried to redirect the narrative, making Linda seem like the victim. "Mr. Matthews, would you say that Linda might have felt threatened by Marcus? After all, he did slap her back, didn't he?" John shifted in his seat, his voice firm. "No, sir. Marcus only reacted after she hit him first. He wasn't threatening her, she was the aggressor from the start. She treated him like he didn't belong there, like he wasn't equal." Linda's face hardened, and she whispered something to her lawyer. He leaned forward, subtly reminding the jury that Linda had felt threatened, a thinly veiled attempt to play on racial stereotypes. The tension in the room thickened, the trial now a battle not just of facts but of ingrained biases. After hours of deliberation, the jury filed back in. Marcus sat silently, his heart pounding. The judge spoke, her voice clear. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Linda Parker, guilty of assault and property damage." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marcus felt a brief wave of relief, but it quickly evaporated as Linda glared at him, her eyes still burning with hatred. The realization hit him hard. Justice may have been served, but the hostility in the room hadn't vanished. He knew this wasn't just about one woman's actions. The system might have recognized his innocence, but the prejudice he faced every day wasn't something a courtroom could fix. As he stood to leave, the weight of societal expectations of being seen as a threat, no matter the facts, settled heavily on his shoulders. Outside the courthouse, Marcus inhaled deeply, the cool air doing little to calm the storm inside him. The victory felt hollow. Sure, Linda had been convicted, but what had really changed? He couldn't forget the way she'd screamed at him, or the way the jury had hesitated before delivering the verdict. As much as justice had been served in the legal sense, the deeper issue of racism remained untouched. As Marcus drove home, his mind raced with thoughts of all the times he had been judged not for his actions but for his skin. This was just one battle in a long, exhausting war. The bitterness gnawed at him. Linda would go home, probably still seeing herself as a victim, blind to the damage she had caused. This was far from over. Marcus knew he'd face this fight again, that the world wasn't ready to see black men like him as anything but threats. The road ahead seemed long, and the victory behind him felt more like survival than triumph.